In a world where the rich lived in grand castles and the poor toiled in the fields, the life of a medieval peasant was anything but easy. Imagine being born into a life where your every move was controlled by the lord of the manor, and your future was as predictable as the season cycles. This was the reality for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe. The peasants, or villeins as they were often called, were the backbone of the feudal system, but they were also its most exploited members. Despite their crucial role in feeding the kingdom, they lived in constant fear, poverty, and oppression. This essay will take you on a journey through the life of a medieval peasant, from their daily struggles to their rare moments of rebellion. Life as a medieval peasant began at birth, and it was a life marked by hard labor and little hope. The term villein came from the Latin word villa, meaning a country house or estate, but over time, it took on a negative connotation. Peasants were neither entirely free nor completely enslaved, but they were bound to the land they worked. They owed their lord rent or labor in exchange for the right to use the land, and in return, they received a form of protection and access to the lord's justice. However, this protection often came at a steep price. Peasants were required to pay a variety of taxes and fees. They had to pay a hearth tax, a tithe to the church, and various aids for the lord's ransom, the knighting of his son, and the marriage of his daughter. They also had to pay fees for using the lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, and his cider press to make their apple cider. Even when a peasant died, they owed the heriot, which was the best possession they owned, to the lord. These fees and taxes left little for the peasants to live on, and many struggled to feed their families. The agricultural work of a peasant was grueling. They had to plow the fields, sow the seeds, cut the hay, and harvest the crops. They were required to work on the Lord's fields before their own, and if a storm or pests threatened the harvest, they had to save the Lord's crops first. This meant that their own fields often suffered, and food shortages were common. Peasants who could afford a plow and a plow horse had a slight advantage, but most were too poor to own these tools and had to rent them or use simpler methods like hoes and spades. The life of a peasant was not just about farming. They had to repair roads, bridges, and moats, gather firewood, take care of stables and kennels, and perform a variety of crafts for the castle. By the 14th century, some of these tasks were done by hired hands, and the castle's needs were often met by purchases from towns and peddlers. This left a larger part of the peasantry on a rent-paying basis, but they still owed a certain number of days of work on the Lord's fields. Despite their hard work, the peasants lived in constant fear of famine. Transportation was poor, and the yield from their fields was low due to a lack of fertilizer. Local shortages were common, and the diet of the poorest peasants was limited to bread, onions, and a little fruit. They slept on straw, lived without furniture, and their homes were simple one-story houses with thatched roofs and plaster walls. The houses had Dutch doors to let in light and air and let out smoke, and some had tiny windows. The best houses had walled chimneys. The middle group of peasants had a slightly better life. They owned a few acres of land, had some economic security, and could afford basic household items like a bed, a trestle table, benches, a chest, a cupboard, and cooking utensils. They lived in wood-framed houses with thatched roofs and plaster walls. They had access to eggs, salt fish, cheese, lard, peas, beans, shallots, onions, garlic, and some leaf vegetables grown in their kitchen gardens. They could also enjoy fruits cooked in juice or dried for winter, rye bread, honey, and beer or cider. The affluent few among the peasants owned large amounts of land, plow horses, sheep, pigs, cattle, and other livestock. They had stores of wool, hides, and hemp, and they grew wheat, oats, and corn. Some even owned boats and nets for fishing in the river, vineyards, and woodpiles. Their homes contained multiple featherbeds, wooden beds, tables, skillets, pots, sheets, tablecloths, and other household items. They could afford to employ field hands and give their daughters substantial dowries. However, the majority of peasants lived a life of poverty and despair. They were overworked, underfed, and often sick. Diseases like dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia, asthma, tooth decay, and scent. Anthony's fire, now known as erysipelas or ergot poisoning, were common. Life expectancy was short. and the peasants were often seen as a lower class by the nobles and the church. The church, which was supposed to offer comfort and hope, often reinforced the peasants' low status by teaching that failure to do the Lord's work and pay tithes would result in eternal punishment in hell. The contempt for peasants was widespread among the upper classes. They were depicted in stories and ballads as aggressive, insolent, greedy, sullen, suspicious, and ugly. The name Jacques, or Jacques Bonhomme, was used by nobles to mock peasants, and it was derived from the padded surplice called a jack that peasants wore for protection in war. Knights saw peasants as people of ignoble instincts, who could not understand honor and were therefore untrustworthy. The extreme hatred of peasants is evident in a passage from the tale, Le Despit aux Villains, which expresses a deep loathing for peasants and their perceived luxurious lifestyle. The peasants were blamed for eating beef and goose, drinking the best wines, and wearing fine clothes. The story suggests that peasants should eat thistles, briars, thorns, straw, and hay, and live in constant trouble and hardship. This kind of rhetoric was often used to justify the mistreatment of peasants by the upper classes. Despite the oppression, the peasants occasionally rebelled. One of the most famous peasant revolts was the Jacquerie, which began in 1358. The peasants were pushed to their limits by the constant attacks from brigands, the demands of the lords, and the failures of the nobles to protect them. On May 28, 1358, a group of peasants in the village of Saint-Leu near Senlis held an indignation meeting after Vespers. They blamed the nobles for their miseries and the capture of the king. Without any arms, they attacked the nearest manor, killed the knight and his family, and burned the place down. The rebellion spread rapidly, and thousands of peasants joined in, attacking castles and manors across the Oise Valley and other regions. The peasants, led by a strong and eloquent man named Guillaume Carl or Cal, organized themselves and formed a council. They appointed captains and lieutenants and fashioned weapons from scythes and billhooks. They adopted Montjoy as their battle cry and used banners with the fleur-de-lis to show they were rising against the nobles, not the king. The nobles, caught off guard, fled to the walled towns, leaving their homes and goods behind. The peasants burned and looted the castles and manors, and in some cases, they committed atrocities against the nobles. The Jacquerie was eventually suppressed by the nobles, who regrouped and organized a counterattack. The peasants were outnumbered and outmatched, and the rebellion was brutally crushed. Many peasants were killed, and the leaders were executed. The Jacquerie, however, left a lasting impression on medieval society. It highlighted the deep-seated resentment and anger of the peasants, and the need for reform in the feudal system. In conclusion, the life of a medieval peasant was one of constant struggle and oppression. They were bound to the land, subjected to heavy taxes and fees, and lived in fear of famine and disease. Despite their hard work, they were often seen as a lower class by the nobles and the church. The Jacquerie was a moment of rebellion that showed the depth of the peasants' grievances, but it also highlighted the brutal reality of their lives. The medieval peasant story is a reminder of the power of the human spirit to resist oppression and fight for a better life, even in the face of overwhelming odds.